Hey, what's going on, guys? We have some devastating breaking news. The UFC 299 co-main event, Dustin Poirier versus Benoit Saint-Denis, is officially off, but it was never really on because there was never a bout agreement in place for Dustin Poirier versus Benoit Saint-Denis. And this is devastating. This is unfortunate. And there's been a slew of recent fight announcements coming from Dana White that are not official. Now, some of these are common knowledge that we knew they weren't official and maybe they're still going to work out, but there's some of them that you guys may not know about that we're going to discuss in this very video, and there's more than you probably think. But let's start off with Dustin Poirier versus Benoit Saint-Denis. So it initially started out, Dustin Poirier tweeted out a picture of him in training, and he says, "My fight is off, but still working." And then that led to media members reaching out to Dustin Poirier, and Ariel Helwani posted, "I reached out to Dustin Poirier about his tweet that the BSD fight at 299 is off. His response, quote, "There was no contractual agreement before the fight was announced and we couldn't come to terms." That is super unfortunate. So Dustin Poirier, Benoit Saint-Denis is off of UFC 299, which was a banger co-main event, but the UFC has a history of doing this. I've talked about it ad nauseum on the channel. I know a lot of people are going to try to bury Dustin Poirier. They're going to say, Dustin Poirier's ducking BSD. I tweeted out jokingly earlier today, there's somebody creating their whole online presence around the fact that maybe Dustin Poirier ducked Benoit Saint-Denis, and they're going to portray that for the next couple years. But that is just simply not the case. And this has happened time in and time out. We're going to go through some notable examples, but we're also going to go through some recent fight announcements that may not even still be official that are coming up on massive pay-per-view cards. We're going to discuss that in this very video, but this just sucks. This just sucks. And it's just, you looked at 299 and everyone was like, oh my God, 299 is so much better than UFC 300, which I completely disagreed with. 300, even though we don't have all the fights for 300, I thought 300 was objectively better than 299, but fair enough, it's an opinion. Well, there's no debate. That debate is completely off the table now. Dustin Poirier versus Benoit Saint-Denis was the best fight on UFC 299, and now it is not happening. And for those of you who don't understand what happens when a fight comes together, the UFC and the matchmakers get together and they say, okay, I want to make Dustin Poirier versus Benoit Saint-Denis. Then what happens is they send out a bout agreement to both fighters. Well, first they call their managers, ask them, they get them to verbally agree. Then if they're verbally agreeing, they send out bout agreements to the fighters. The fighters then sign the bout agreements, then fax them back to the UFC, and now it is official because we have a bonding contract that they're going to fight each other with financial terms already kind of, written into those bout agreements, because sometimes, even though fighters are on certain contracts, they're independent contractors, and sometimes fighters like to renegotiate between fights. Even if they're on like a 3-4 fight deal left in their contract, they might renegotiate financial terms because of the card or because of a quick turnaround or whatever it may be. So in this case, Dana White went on YouTube or Instagram, wherever he announced it, and he announces Dustin Poirier versus Benoit Saint-Denis. Meanwhile, Dustin Poirier did not sign the bout agreement, did not have a bout agreement, did not come to terms. They were negotiating it. And then Benoit Saint-Denis didn't even know he was fighting Dustin Poirier. Because we know this because his coach, and keep in mind, Benoit Saint-Denis says he's still staying on UFC 299, so we'll talk about potential replacement opponents for Dustin Poirier, or to fill in for Dustin Poirier. But his coach said they were shocked when they announced that Dustin Poirier was taking on Benoit Saint-Denis, and then apparently Saint-Denis' wife or girlfriend, I can't remember the exact tweet, I'll put it up on the screen, woke him up and told him, "You're fighting Dustin Poirier," because they didn't even know. The UFC operates sometimes like a fly-by-night company. And what they do, whether it's just sure kind of, incompetence, or it's just, they're just like, oh, we're so big and we're so bad, we do whatever we want. We're alpha males, Dana White and, the way he acts. And they just say, oh, we're going to announce these fights and everyone will just fall in line. We don't care if they agree or don't agree. But also sometimes it has to do with promotion. And in this case, they're like, oh, we want Dustin Poirier, Benoit Saint-Denis. We're not even going to bother calling Dustin Poirier or sending him a contract. And we're not even going to bother telling Benoit Saint-Denis he has a fight. And we're just going to announce it. And then they're going to find out online. I just think that's so unprofessional and embarrassing for a multi-billion-dollar company to do. And you hear this, I mean, I've heard this for years. I mean, fights that are being announced that are unsigned, sometimes fighters don't even know that fight is even potentially happening. Like Saint-Denis didn't even know he was potentially fighting Poirier. All of a sudden he finds out and he's like happy as hell because he's getting to fight a top-ranked guy. And the UFC just announces it. And this happens with cuts as well. And I know some of the lower level guys, of course, not everyone's going to get a personalized phone call from Dana White. But at the bare minimum, somebody in the company should be calling you and say, look, we're letting you go before that's officially announced to kind of the general public. But that's just not what the UFC does. And there's a multitude of reasons. Again, it could just be incompetence. It could be laziness. It could just be the fact they're a fly-by-night company and they just don't care. They're just going to announce it to get the fans excited regardless of what's going on. But sometimes, and this may be the case in Dustin Poirier, and a lot of the times, it is to put public pressure on a fighter. So let's say Dustin Poirier is in the midst of negotiating a new contract. Regardless of who he fights next, he wants a new contract. The UFC doesn't like that. So to put pressure on him in his negotiations, they will announce him a big, massive fight. The fans get all excited. Everyone's happy about this fight. And then Dustin Poirier is like, well, wait a second. I didn't sign this. But Dustin Poirier doesn't want to come out and rain on everyone's parade in case he does sign a new deal. But at the same time, he's like, well, I didn't sign this. But now everyone's excited for his new fight announcement. And he's kind of put in a tough spot where now he's almost forced to take the fight. Otherwise, it looks like he pulled out and he's ducking the opponent. And he's forced to potentially take whatever offer the UFC is willing to give him, even if he's not happy with it, because now he's dealing with public pressure because all the fans are now excited for this fight. And we're going to talk about another example of this that's been going on for the last 2 years that has absolutely crucified one of the fighters in the UFC, one of the top level fighters in the UFC. But that's most likely what was going on here. The UFC announced this fight as a negotiating tactic for Dustin Poirier to go against Dustin Poirier. We know they have shady negotiation tactics. We have a well-documented history of that. And unfortunately, Dustin Poirier over the last 2, 3, 4 weeks, I don't remember exactly when it was announced. I believe it was the beginning of January. Dustin Poirier's been hoping that a deal gets into place, and he comes to terms with the UFC. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. And now Dustin Poirier comes out and says, look, this fight's off. And now a lot of fans are going to shit on Dustin Poirier and say, Dustin Poirier's ducking BSD. Dustin Poirier doesn't want to fight any contenders. Now, there's always kind of, these situations are more nuanced than that. And maybe, there is situations where fighters are pricing themselves out of fights and whatnot. But Dustin Poirier isn't scared of any fighter. That's just not true. He's coming off a KO loss against Justin Gaethje. He's not scared to fight Benoit Saint-Denis for the right price. So Dana typically in these types of situations, he's not going to be happy with Dustin Poirier. He's going to come out and say, Dustin Poirier doesn't want to fight. He doesn't want to fight Benoit Saint-Denis. And then you have the UFC shills who are going to say, yeah, the UFC needs to cut Dustin Poirier. He doesn't want to fight any contenders. He's a ranking squatter. And some of that, there can be a bit of truth to that. There's always 6 sides to every story, basically. But at the same time, it's like that narrative is now built in and will go on for years to come that, remember when Dustin Poirier ducked Benoit Saint-Denis? I'm hoping they find a way. Since Dustin went kind of public with this, I doubt that they find a way to put this fight together now. But since he went public with it, this is going to be the new narrative. The new narrative is going to be that Dustin Poirier ducked BSD. And I think Dana White, at his next kind of opportunity, he will double down on that narrative. And we've seen it with Francis Ngannou. We've seen it with other fighters. The fans just fall in line with whatever Daddy Dana White says. And it's embarrassing. I want to get out ahead of it right now and make this video. It's like, no, you shouldn't be mad at Dustin Poirier. You should be mad at the UFC for selling you wolf tickets. By the way, some fans got absolutely scammed who were going to UFC 299. Tickets went on sale January 12th. The fight was announced January 10th. And they put Dustin Poirier and Benoit Saint-Denis on the poster and promoted this massive lightweight fight, encouraging people to buy tickets. And I get it. You can say, oh, well, that's only one fight, Joey, and that's not even the main event. That's the biggest fight on the card. That's bigger than Sean O'Malley versus Marlon Chito Vera. Dustin Poirier versus Benoit Saint-Denis was the people's main event. And now you scam these people who are going to UFC 299 into thinking, oh, we're getting this banger lightweight fight. And I understand 299 is already very deep, but these people are buying tickets for $600, $700, $800, $1,200, $1,500. and they're looking at the card that you're selling them, and you've announced 2 days beforehand a massive fight, encouraging them to buy tickets, and now you find out it was never signed. I understand there's injuries that happens. I understand there's other things out of the UFC's control that happens. But when you have something like this, where you have a fight that was never even signed. This was straight up wolf tickets by the UFC. Shout out Nick Diaz. This was wolf tickets by the UFC. And they have a long checkered past of doing this very thing, even in the last month or two, which we're going to go through some examples here in a second. But I just think this is one of those things where Dana White did it for leverage. He hoped that this fight would come to fruition. And at the end of the day, he's like, oh, if the fight gets canceled, people already bought their tickets anyway. And I know in some states, there is refunds for people who purchase tickets and then the main event falls out, but I don't think that same stipulation falls in line with the co-main event. I do not believe it falls in line with the co-main event. So it's just so unfortunate that you have this amazing lightweight matchup that now isn't coming together at UFC 299. Now, we have some other fights that this has happened recently with, and one fighter I want to single out is Paulo Costa. And I know Paulo Costa is annoying. I know he can be insufferable online, and he's always joking around about whether or not he's pulling out. Paulo Costa has barely pulled out of fights. I know that's news to some of you guys. I go back and watch my reaction video to the announcement of UFC 291. On that card was Paulo Costa versus Nasruddin Imavov. I say in that video, my early prediction for this fight is that it's not signed and it will not happen. The UFC was negotiating with Paulo Costa. They were announcing a fight to put public pressure on Paulo Costa. He did not pull out of that Imavov fight. Now, the Khamzat Chimaev fight, he had staph infection. He pulled out. But what are you going to do? He clearly had staph infection. He clearly tried to stay in the fight. It's not his fault. You go back to the Robert Whittaker fight, not the one upcoming, and I know he's been joking about pulling out of that, but the one back from UFC 284 of last year. Paulo Costa also never signed to fight Robert Whittaker on that card either. The UFC announced it to sell tickets and to use it as promotion and use it as leverage against Paulo Costa in contract negotiations, and then it ended up not happening. Another fight, and some of these fights, I can't remember which ones are actually public knowledge and which ones aren't, but I can confirm for a fact when every single one of the fights that I'm about to mention, these are all mostly recent fights, when they were announced, they were not official. Again, some of these are public knowledge. They've been reported on by reputable sources. Other ones, I've heard it per legitimate sources as well. You have Sean Brady versus Vicente Luque. Sean Brady recently came out and said he's injured. He's not fighting at Atlantic City. It was supposed to be the main event. That fight was never official. You also have the co-main event, which may end up being the main event for that card. You have Aaron Blanchfield versus Manon Fior. That was never signed. Now, this may be signed now. I don't know. I don't have an update on it. But that was not official when the UFC announced it. You also have, and this one I kind of give a little bit of a pass to, but Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler. I mean, how long is that supposed to have been happening, guys? How long were they advertising those wolf tickets on The Ultimate Fighter? And Michael Chandler's just been sniffing Conor McGregor's asshole for the last 2 years, praying that he gets that fight. And in the UFC, that's a little bit of a different situation, but you get my point. The UFC's been promoting The Ultimate Fighter. They announced that literally like a year ago today, and that still doesn't even have a date yet. You also have Kevin Holland versus Michael Venom Page. That was not official when the UFC announced it. It was not official, and it may still not be completely official because the UFC sometimes announces these fights and they hope that everything falls together later, before the fight even happens. There's sometimes, I forgot what fight it was. There was a big fight in the last 2 years. I think it was Adesanya versus somebody, maybe Cannonier, but I can't remember for sure, where Adesanya signed his bout agreement the week of the fight. So sometimes these things come down to the wire before fighters are actually signing on the dotted line and the UFC's announcing these fights. Now, obviously, they could have had a different type of agreement before that fight, so that's a little bit of a weirder example, but this is something that goes on and on and on. In the UFC, we see it all the time. The UFC lies. Dana White wants to have these self-aggrandizing moments where he announces these massive fight cards on his Instagram story, on his Instagram live, where people are hounding him. Let's oil up Dana. But then the fights ultimately don't come to fruition. There's a lot of fights that just haven't come to fruition because they were never signed. Some other fights, and these are all UFC 300 fights, and I couldn't confirm because the person I was talking to couldn't remember exactly which ones weren't signed and were signed. But 2 out of these 3 fights for UFC 300, when they were announced, were not signed. Aljamain Sterling versus Calvin Kattar. Yuri Prohaska versus Alexander Rakic, and Bo Nickel versus Cody Brumdage. I almost said Bumdage again. Cody Brumdage. But I don't remember he didn't remember which 2 of those weren't signed. But 2 out of those 3 were not signed. And I believe Blanchfield versus Fior was announced in that batch as well, if my memory serves correct. So you had 4 fights. 3 out of the 4, when they were announced, they were not officially signed. There was not bout agreements in place. So I absolutely hate this. I feel gutted for people who are going to UFC 299. They should get some type of discount on their ticket. They should get some type of refund. Hopefully the UFC finds a replacement for Dustin Poirier to fight Benoit Saint-Denis. And honestly, I think the perfect scenario would be Benoit Saint-Denis taking on Michael Chandler. First off, that's a straight up banger of a fight. And I know, Michael Chandler, Conor McGregor is supposed to happen. It's never happening. Michael Chandler can keep sniffing that asshole. He can beg Conor to take him into the NBA Finals public restroom and finish him. It's just not happening. Michael Chandler is waiting for a red panty night that's never coming. He's leaving his family for a training camp for a mythical fight at a mythical weight class that is not officially signed at all, and there's no guarantee that fight is even happening. So Michael Chandler, you've already wasted almost 2 years of your career begging for Conor McGregor to fight you. Benoit Saint-Denis has a lot of hype behind him. That'd be a banger fight. That would be a suitable replacement for UFC 299. And guess what, Chandler? If you're watching this, Chandler, if Benoit Saint-Denis knocks you out, hear me out. If he knocks you out, you have a better chance of getting the Conor McGregor fight. You have a better chance of getting the Conor McGregor fight if Benoit Saint-Denis knocks you out. So keep that in mind. I would love that as a replacement. I don't know what else they could potentially book. Maybe they could get Beneil Dariush. I mean, he's willing to take any and all fights. He's an absolute savage. But he's like 75 years old. He's been brutally KO'd in his last 2 fights. Now we're going to throw him in against Benoit Saint-Denis. I don't know if I love that matchup, to be quite honest. And also, there's some speculation. What's next for Dustin Poirier now? Could this be a calculated decision by the UFC because they're going to book maybe Conor McGregor versus Dustin Poirier 4? I don't think that's going to happen. Only because I don't know if the UFC is going to want to reward Dustin Poirier for basically not bending to their will. But at the same time, I think Conor McGregor versus Dustin Poirier 4 is a bigger fight than Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler. You have the whole storyline of Conor broke his leg and he wants to come back and get revenge. And Conor McGregor is one of the most salty fighters on the roster. You know he's still pining over that loss. So there's a chance maybe Conor pushes for that. And Michael Chandler, okay, now he's left without an opponent. Michael Chandler's always looking to put on exciting performances. Benoit Saint-Denis kind of checks that box. He also has to fight at some point in time. He's getting up there in age. His career is going to be over soon, and he's going to sit out the entire last 3 years of his career waiting for Conor McGregor. I don't think so. So there is a chance that could fall into place. I don't know. I would love to see a Dustin Poirier-Dan Hooker rematch. That was one of the best fights of 2020. It's a shame that was in the Apex. Would love to see that rematch. I don't think, honestly, you can go wrong with any fights with Dustin Poirier right now. But I am gutted that this fight isn't happening. But I do think there is suitable replacements that you can kind of throw together. And I'm hoping, Michael Chandler's been wanting to fight. Please, UFC, book Michael Chandler versus Benoit Saint-Denis. That would fix UFC 299. But let me just say, no matter what, UFC 300 is already better than UFC 299. Even before this fight cancellation, now it's not even close. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to like the video. And thank you so much for watching.